Show me. Get Bond.
There's something else.
Restrict Bond's movements. Cancel his cards. Put an alert on his passports, all of them.
Looks like there's someone who wants to talk to you.
Mr. Bond, you have an urgent phone call.
It's a soundproof room, Mr. Bond. Nobody hears you scream.
Defiant to the last. Your people have abandoned you. Your very existence denied. Why stay silent? Torowa!
Looks all right. Tell me, why are you interested in this job?
I need a steady job, Mr. Wiley, with a chance to go places.
I see. Now, this one job you had with the Central Distributing Company. You worked there for 18 months?
Yes, sir.
Why did you leave?
Because I wasn't getting anywhere. After 18 months, I figured I was worth more than they were paying me. And I figured I was ready for promotion to more important work.
I see.
Honest, Mr. Wiley, it was a rotten company. I don't know why I stayed as long as I did.
Tell me, were you fired?
Yes, I was. But it wasn't my fault. The company just up and started firing people. Retrenching, they called it. What do you think of that?
I think it's a pretty normal situation. A business has to live within its income. Many factors affect that income. Sales, general economic conditions, the development of new industries that replace old ones. For these and many other reasons, businesses often go through periods of adjustment and reorganization when they're forced to let people go.
I didn't do anything. Why me?
Being fired from a job can be a really humiliating thing. It's not the best feeling in the world to get axed, especially from a gig that you actually enjoy doing. People can have pretty strong reactions to it. A lot of the things that Pierce Brosnan said after it was revealed he was no longer going to be James Bond illustrated this. When asked if there was any bitterness about the whole situation, Brosnan replied, "Bitterness against whom? And for what reason?" Now, I'm not sure what or how exactly all this went down. There was really no official announcement. News started trickling out that Brosnan was deemed too old, and the producers wanted a younger 007. When asked about this, Brosnan was cloudy and didn't give any direct answers. Finally, Brosnan confirmed that his time as Bond was over. It's absolutely over. It was kind of a surprise. What we do know is that in 2002, Brosnan had said he was going to do a fifth Bond film. And really, as tough as it is for me to say it, it made sense. Whether you're a fan of Bros or not, I wasn't. The majority of the audience adored him. Whether you were a fan of his Bond films or not, I wasn't. They were extremely popular. They were taking in tons of money. Despite Die Another Day being a mess of a movie, it ended up grossing over $400 million worldwide. He was a regular cash cow. Any uneasiness the filmmakers in studio might have felt with Timothy Dalton, the audience not warming to him, the underwhelming popularity of his films, all of those concerns were quickly erased when Bros came on board. So why change things now? I figured they would stick with Bros for as long as they could. But then, something happened. Rumblings started up that Bros wasn't going to come back. There were rumors that he was demanding too much money. Demands that were apparently too steep for Barbara and Michael to meet. There might be some truth to this. The way the press recounted the story was that Bros was set to do his fifth Bond film, which seems to be true.
Well, they've invited me back, and I've said yes, so it looks like there'll be a fifth.
I mean, there, he says it. The rumors at the time was that Bros wanted a $30 to $40 million payday. Apparently he did ask for a raise, since at one point he remarked, there was certainly a salary there that was not out of the ballpark, that other men and women have received for the same type of film. That might have been the tipping point where they felt it was time to part company. We're probably never going to know exactly what went down. Maybe 20, 30 years from now when someone finally decides to spill the beans, but for now it's left as a hazy breakup. Finally in 2004, Bros said that Bond was behind him. Bond is another lifetime behind me. And he added, we went out on a high. He considers this a high, I guess. I look back affectionately at that time and doing those 4 movies. But I've said all I gotta say on it. Despite initially saying he felt no bitterness from the situation, he apparently did. What was strange was the resentment Bros had, and it didn't seem like he was trying too hard to hide it. He point blank criticized the producers. They don't know how to move on. A sense of paralysis has set in. They said I wanted too much money, which is nonsense. This sounds like bitterness to me. Build a bridge and get over it. It was like he was trying to hold on to this gig like a pope. It was clearly not a very harmonious breakup, which I found even stranger. Here was Bros, who came along, was really beloved, and in a lot of people's eyes brought Bond back to life. His films did colossal business. Practically everyone loved him as 007. And here he is, now sounding like a disgruntled ex-employee who got unfairly canned. There was an ugliness to this. Bros didn't really leave any doubt that he wanted to come back and do his Bond number 5. I'm pretty confident had Bros done Bond 21, it would have been another huge hit. Even if they had made it Die Another Day Part 2, it would have made tons of money. But I guess the producers had second thoughts about continuing with Brosnan and realized the series needed freshening up and be taken in a new direction. If Die Another Day didn't look dated and awkward already, a new spy series that began in 2002 showed a revitalized take on secret agents, one that would be a major influence on the direction 007 would have to take if he wanted to stay relevant in a new era of the spy genre.
You, red bag, the red bag, stop right there! Put your hands up! I don't know what happened! I don't know who this guy was! I don't know about that picture! I don't know who I am!
The Bourne Identity would present a darker, more violent, more realistic spy film. The character would have conflicted emotions. Killing would be much more ruthless, violent, hands-on, and deaths would have repercussions. Action scenes would be faster paced and kinetic with the help of a rapid editing style. The action would consist of filming real-life stunts. Jason Bourne would be a loner who's struggling not only to survive physically, but mentally as well. And it would lose the tongue-in-cheek humor. Where are the one-liners? If you're a spy and you kill someone, you have to say something witty. Where are the jokes? The Bourne films would inject a revitalized jolt into what audiences expected from spy thrillers. Even Brosnan recognized the impact Jason Bourne was having on the spy genre. He would later say that he anticipated being fired when the Bourne identity topped the box office charts. Let's face it, even had the Bourne films never been made, Die Another Day marked another one of those points in the Bond series that things started to go overboard. Over the top. Silly. Idiotic. And just plain dumb. I think it's actually the biggest out-of-hand entry in the entire series. Yeah, I think it's more ridiculous than that one. At least that one was fun. So let's assume Brosnan was gearing up for his Bond number 5. I always assumed it would have been one of those Bond films that was meant to reestablish the series back to its roots. Not focus on the outrageous spectacle and settle things down again, like Majesty's and For Your Eyes Only had done, following the extravagant Bond adventures that preceded those films. We would see Bond doing more regular spy kind of stuff, more realistic fights and stunts, pare down the gadgets, and just be a more overall believable adventure, starring the character Ian Fleming created. Really, at this point, Brosnan had nowhere else to go. Maybe hang gliding off a meteor or something. While firing a machine gun, of course. I think that fantasy element of those earlier Bonds with Connery taking on larger-than-life villains started to fade away. Audiences in the 21st century expect a bit more reality and realness with Bond. You could argue back and forth whether Craig's Bond is the closest to Fleming's original version, but I don't think general movie audiences really worry about that. They have their view of the cinematic James Bond, and that's who they're used to seeing. But even those casual fans had to realize, after 40 years, the old Bond format had been parodied to death. Everyone did a spoof of the old classic films. The Bond films had to change things up to stay relevant. The Brosnan age tried to keep the status quo going, while flirting with adding deeper and darker aspects to the films. The problem was they only lightly skimmed the surface of them, then forgot them completely to get back to being a traditional Bond adventure. It wasn't enough. They couldn't have it both ways. Either go all the way with it, or don't even bother. Not only Bourne, but other films and TV shows fully embraced the darker nature of the spy genre, and started to ignore the Bond template that had come before. A host of other secret agents and spies and government field operatives, they were all running around in more hard-boiled settings, dealing with more complex characters and having a harder-edged tone than the world of 007. It started to raise expectations and really start to make Bond look behind the times. If the Bond series hadn't tried a radical change, the films could have potentially continued to look like a shadow of its former self, that was still trying to get by on the old tricks it had already used up, which had now become a joke. Brosnan apparently wanted this too. One of the quotes he made during his tantrum tirades was how he was looking forward to making Bond gritty. I always found this statement amusing. For one thing, he had already done 4 Bond films. He had established his Bond persona. If he wanted to take the character into gritty territory, it probably would have happened already. Plus, one could interpret that statement as Brosnan not being completely satisfied with how he got to play Bond. That perhaps he wanted to delve deeper into the character, but his films just never allowed him the opportunity to. Brosnan seemed to know what the problems were with the scripts of the Bond films he was doing. During this period when it wasn't known if he would really come back or not, he critiqued Die Another Day in an interview in GQ. They promoted that film as being a real departure, since it had Bond get captured and tortured and all that, which it really was nothing. And Brosnan knew it. I'm not sure if the best way to get your job back is by criticizing your bosses. But Brosnan was completely right. It might have cost him his job, but I have to give him credit for that. I'm talking about this as if it's something new. Make the Bond character more interesting and human. Get into some emotional territory with the guy. The Bourne films can't be credited with sparking this idea. This has been going on for years.
I think he should have been more humane, more understanding towards people in general. And he's not such a Superman, even though he's been taught karate and judo, and he's an expert with a gun, and he's a physical beast. You know, if anyone wants to tangle with him.
Definitely darker.
More character, less gadgets.
More character, less gadgets.
I think what is appealing to an audience is to see a character who's very strong, but to see a certain vulnerability within that character, accessibility to the audience.
Reality and believability. The film is an escapist fantasy, but it seemed to me that unless the man was human, unless you could believe in him, unless the film was anchored in something that the audience could identify with, one would lose contact with the audience.
Even way back in Thunderball, there's that moment with Bond talking with Domino, telling her that her brother is dead. There's a shaking in Bond's hand, and Connery quickly puts on a pair of sunglasses. It's a subtle moment, but that gesture was meant to hide the tears welling up in the character's eyes. He's got human emotions, like everyone else. Yet even Dalton, who had taken the character furthest with this grittiness, recognized that there should still be some fantasy elements to the stories.
In fact, there's been criticism that too many gags and too many special effects have become the stars of the film. And even though the new movie will have its share of action in exotic locations, Timothy Dalton hopes to once again make James Bond the star of James Bond movies.
You know, a lot of people might say, well, you know, the films have become too flippant or they've become too fantastical, but others would say, that's why I go. I love it.
Those things help make Bond Bond. So it's a very fine balancing act between the two. One thing I always found odd was that during Dalton's first press conference, he talked about the Ian Fleming books.
I intend to approach this project with a sense of responsibility to the work of Ian Fleming.
And he had stated he'd read all of them in preparation for playing the part.
It has to be based upon its foundations, and its foundations are those terrific books of Ian Fleming. I mean, I'd read one or two of them years and years and years ago when I first saw the first movies, but rereading them, they are splendid, and the essence of it all is there.
Years later, about the film Fleming's first Bond story, Daniel Craig stated he read the book.
And what about the original book? Are you going to read that?
I read it, yeah.
But during Brosnan's press conference, I don't remember Fleming's name ever being mentioned.
Bond has kind of been part of my life. As a boy in 1964, I left Ireland. And the first film I ever saw in Putney High Street was Goldfinger, in fact. And
Brosnan talked about Goldfinger and the other films, but that was it. Maybe I just never saw those pieces of the press conference, but I always thought it was strange and wondered if he had ever read any of the Fleming stories, or if his familiarity with the character just ended with the previous films. Anyway, Brosnan seemed on board with the idea of delving deeper into the character way back when he was originally cast, but his subsequent films never really did that. With the first Bourne film coming out 6 months prior, it made Die Another Day look even more ridiculous. Looking at it compared to the Bourne Identity, they don't even look like they're in the same genre. This looks more like science fiction or something. Maybe even fantasy. I half expect to see some elves show up. Instead of having any psychological identity issues, Die Another Day was having characters change their identity sitting in light bright machines. It seemed Lee Tamahori's prediction of the heavy use of CGI in Bond films wasn't what fans wanted to see. Or at least, not yet. I guess it could still happen one day, but for now, no. Brosnan could have conceivably been given his opportunity to be a grittier 007 in an adaptation of the long, unfilmed story of Casino Royale, which had finally fallen into the possession of Ian. In the mid-90s, when Brosnan had just come on board as Bond, he was jumping out of explosions and re-energizing the series. News came out that producer Kevin McClory was planning on making his own competing Bond film, thanks to the rights he still held to Thunderball. McClory had been a thorn in the side of Eon for over 30 years. The quick version is that McClory had assisted Fleming in writing a movie script for a James Bond film in the late 50s. The film was never made, but Fleming used the script as the basis for his novel, Thunderball, without crediting McClory or screenwriter Jack Whittingham. After a tumultuous court case, it was ruled McClory owned the rights to the story. Eon bit the bullet and partnered up with him to make the '65 film. In 1983, McClory again remade the story in the film Never Say Never Again. And then, in 1996, rumblings over at Sony Pictures was that McClory was developing yet another version of the story. I'm not sure how many times he thought he could adapt the same James Bond story. One story doesn't make a series. I complain about Hollywood remakes, but McClory's stranglehold on remaking the script over and over again was pretty asinine. In fact, back in 1989, McClory was teasing he was ready to make another Bond film. Another remake of Thunderball, of course. And who did he have his sights set to star as James Bond in this film? Pierce Brosnan. Now in 1996, McClory was trumpeting that Connery had said he would play a villain, and Timothy Dalton could be the possible Bond in the film. I would have gone to see that. McClory was a very odd duck. I think he just liked spouting out announcements whether they had any validity or not. He just seemed like a showman and just never would let his whole Thunderball thing go. Anyway, this third cinematic Thunderball film initially was titled Warhead 2000 AD. Well, same as back in 1983, Eon weren't too thrilled with this idea. MGM, Eon's parent company, filed a lawsuit against Sony Pictures. Then Sony countersued MGM, saying that McClory was the co-author of the cinematic Bond, and was owed royalties from every Bond film ever made. It's funny how it took him 30 years to make this argument. In the end, the company settled out of court. Sony paid MGM $5 million for damages, and gave up any rights to making their own James Bond film. MGM agreed they would not lodge any protest over the rights to Sony's Spider-Man franchise. Then they paid Sony $10 million for the rights to Casino Royale, including the film rights and the rights to the 1967 spoof film. Ironically, all this was somewhat pointless when in 2004, Sony Pictures bought MGM. They gained full rights to the James Bond films. However, production and final say over everything involving the film versions of James Bond would be controlled by Eon Productions. By the time the dust settled with all this court nonsense, adapting Casino Royale into the official series had to wait. Pre-production had already begun on Die Another Day. So Casino Royale would have to wait, and we would have to be forced to watch Jinx first. Director Quentin Tarantino apparently had his sights on filming Casino Royale. There were even rumors he tried outbidding Eon for the rights. He intended his version to have been set in the 1950s, the same time the novel was written. It would have been filmed in black and white, and starring Brosnan as an older, more mature Bond, who was nearing the end of his 00 career. I'm not sure how Tarantino's Casino Royale would have been. Maybe it would have been good, but I can't help but think that it would have been Tarantino's James Bond, and no real resemblance to Fleming's. he probably would have had a lot of colorful dialogue getting tossed back and forth over that poker table. As we know, this didn't happen, and Tarantino has been pretty vocal about his failed attempt at doing his own James Bond film. Maybe Barbara and Michael are real skunks. I don't know, but Tarantino sure sounds arrogant talking about it.
The reason they did Casino Royale all comes down to me. Because...
Well, why don't you just big yourself up while you're
Well, it's the truth. I mean, the thing about it is, I made it a point that I said I wanted to do Casino Royale. They were already on record as saying that the movie was unfilmable. But then after I said it and talked about it for a little bit, then the big thing on all the internets was that was what the fans wanted to see. And so that's when they, oh, maybe it's not so unfilmable now.
Well,
I mean, Broccoli and Saltzman had said they always would have liked to film Casino Royale, but were just not able to. I don't know what he means, unfilmable. It sounds like Tarantino is talking a lot of crap. So this is where a decision apparently was made by the producers that Brosnan would not work if they were to film Casino Royale, and out he went. It kind of makes sense to me. Had they done a Casino Royale film with Brosnan, it definitely would have been his swan song as Bond anyway. So rather than use Casino Royale, a story Eon had never been able to acquire, was the first Fleming Bond story, use that as a farewell to Brosnan's Bond, they'd be better off using it as an introduction to a new Bond. It seemed like an ideal showcase for a new start. I will say it was kind of a shame the way Brosnan exited from the role. He was a good soldier, did the films he was presented with, and they made a crapload of money. I would have thought things would have ended on a bit more friendlier note. But it ended up seeming like one of the most hostile splits in the series. Let's take a look. We had Connery getting fed up with playing Bond. It was rumored he was completely sick of it, hated being typecast, and plus had his own feelings that he was not being paid enough when the film started raking in truckloads of dough. And on top of that, he never got a cut of the merchandising. I guess that's one of the reasons he got them to open up their wallet so big when they asked him to come back for Diamonds Are Forever. And then he agreed to do Never Say Never Again, which might have been partly motivated by his grudge against Cubby Broccoli. But even after that, Eon never really said anything bad about him. They would probably come off looking like real jerks if they ever did. Criticizing Connery? Sacrilege. Lazenby had a pretty nasty departure. I still don't know for sure if he was fired or just quit. There's always conflicting stories I hear about that. It was clear he was full of himself, and didn't endear himself to anyone, though.
But what about the reports that you were deliberately awkward and hostile?
Yeah, well, they were true in a way because I was very uptight lots of the times because I didn't understand exactly what was going on.
Either way, he was out, and Eon didn't really look back at him, and the general audience forgot about him pretty quickly. Roger Moore, very popular Bond. He graciously left the role. He's admitted that he probably stuck around longer than he should have, but they kept asking him back. Broccoli loved him, and now he's become the ambassador of sorts to Bond. Timothy Dalton would have come back if it hadn't been for another one of those friggin' legal issues delaying his third Bond film. He left the stage with no regrets. I never thought he seemed to care too much about the fame attached to being Bond anyway. He maintained a good relationship with the Broccoli's. I remember reading once he was even one of the pallbearers at Cubby's funeral. Even today he sounds very happy with what he did with Bond. Then Brosnan. There sounds like a lot of animosity between him and Eon. He's the one actor who seems like he was not ready to leave, and has been very vocal about it. It's pretty strange. He almost makes it sound like he was robbed from continuing the role. In his defense, I've been focusing a lot on Brosnan's ranting, mainly because that was the most memorable stuff said regarding his departure, and because it's pretty friggin' funny. He might not have had anything nice to say about the producers. Maybe they really are jerks. But eventually he did offer up some nice words of encouragement to his Bond successor, who was looking like he could really use it. Craig. Once speculation began that we were getting a new Bond, Craig's name was mentioned with a host of other candidates. A bunch of actors did auditions, Craig among them. Before there was any official announcement, the news broke that Craig was the new 007 prematurely. A sneaky reporter called his mother asking her how she felt now that her son was going to be James Bond. Unknowingly, she said she was thrilled, thereby confirming that Craig got the part. It's no wonder most celebrities hate reporters. The official announcement was accompanied by Craig being escorted down the Thames by the Royal Navy. I thought it looked kind of silly. I don't know why the producers felt the need to make such a big show about it. I know it's big news, but the silly circus presentation is something I could do without. I mean, I know he's just an actor playing a role. He didn't just become the real James Bond, who has to do all this daredevil stuff. I remember they did a similar thing with Dalton at the movie premiere. Yeah. Do they seriously expect us to believe that was actually Dalton? It's just so silly.
Timothy Dalton, thanks for dropping in. It's a great pleasure to be here, Nick.
At least Brosnan didn't have to do this stuff. He just showed up in a beard at a press conference. This big pomp and circumstance with Craig's first appearance backfired, and the press hooked on how un-James Bond he looked wearing a life jacket.
But they wouldn't let me on them without this life jacket. So immediately that was the first thing the press hit upon him. Oh, what a pansy. He has to wear a life jacket.
Yes. You should have been in a tuxedo.
Probably,
But instead you're in that.
Probably, yeah. I always had this long hair because I was doing this job, which was
long hair,
which was kind of like
water
weird.
wings.
It was all wrong. Water wings on.
This was the first of many criticisms that were hurled at Craig before anyone even saw him in the role. So we get the press conference, with Craig fending off some pretty stupid questions.
Inevitable question, I suppose. James Bond is a legendary womanizer, and who would be your ideal Bond girl, Kate Moss or Sienna Miller?
I'm not going to get into that.
Could you tell me what sort of girl would be your ideal Bond girl, both looks and personality-wise?
Actor at the moment who you would have liked to have played Bond other than yourself?
Sometimes I wonder about these people who show up to these things. I understand they have to get some quotes for their papers, but...
why do you want to be Bond?
Why? Why not? I mean, really, why not? Yeah.
Why yes?
But why not?
But really, what kind of question is that? I would have preferred it if it was a room full of Bond fans who got to ask stuff.
Are you looking forward to becoming a legend?
Oh, I don't know about that.
And these people get paid for this. It was clear that Craig was going to have an uphill battle. He was something of a surprise to the general public. I remember I had my money on Clive Owen. I was familiar with Craig, saw him in some movies, but didn't know what kind of 007 he was going to make. He was certainly a different choice, which, honestly, I was all for. I was ready for some major changes with the series after the Brosnan age. So although he might have seemed an unexpected choice, I was willing to give him a chance. After he was announced, that's when I checked out Layer Cake, and then I started to see why they might have chosen him. I think that film actually cemented him landing the Bond role. It's a pretty good audition film for playing Bond. Immediately, everyone seemed to get hung up on his blonde hair. But really, I could have cared less. The fact he wasn't a traditionally good-looking leading man, something that everyone had come to associate with being James Bond. But he looked okay to me. What I was more interested in was what he was going to do with the character. To me, Brosnan might have been the ideal Bond, looks-wise. But that seemed to be the only thing he brought to the part. Maybe now they wouldn't worry so much about the superficial and start to focus on some other things. There was this whole anti-Craig movement, which is fine. Fans all have their opinions. Everyone has their favorite Bond and has a picture of what the character should be in their heads. But things started to get ruthless. At least give the guy a chance to shoot one scene before attacking him.
It got a lot worse, because that was the press.
Right.
When it hit the internet, then it just doubled in size.
Of course.
And
is that when you learned don't look at the internet?
No, I was in the Bahamas, and I just got a call from one of my people who just said, you know, it's looking not so good. And I'm like, what do you mean? What do you mean? It's all going great. We make a great movie. It's all good. And it's like, well, yes, it's just the public opinion. It's not in your favour.
While you were filming?
Oh, yeah, right in the middle of filming. Of course, I went straight to the internet and went, oh my God, and sort of typed in my name, and then you spend the next 5 hours, like, going down to some blog that's happened, and you know, where someone's just spitting that I'm doing this role, and then I switched the computer off and I went, well, what can I do about it? It's too late. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm doing it now.
Just make the best movie
Just
you
make
can.
the best movie we can.
I would much rather have an actor who might not resemble the physical description of Fleming's Bond, but is doing something interesting with his interpretation of the character, than a guy who might be the picture-perfect embodiment of the character, but is doing this. Craig got a lot of flack. All during production, mainly the only reports by the press were negative. Craig can't drive a stick. Not true. He got his teeth knocked out. Not true. He only lost 2 caps. I think other than Lazenby, Craig had the roughest time being a new 007. Laze followed the most famous Bond ever, so when audiences saw him in a tux, it didn't go down that well. The big fry guy from TV? He's James Bond? Yeah, right. Moore was already a popular star from The Saint, and gradually he was accepted by the public in the role. Dalton wasn't liked. Fans were disappointed Brosnan lost out on the part at the time. Maybe since it was public knowledge that NBC screwed them out of having Bros, they blamed the network more than Dalton. But still, he didn't garner many fans. I think most of the audience were like, whatever. Then when Bros came along, everyone seemed to love him. No complaints. Finally! All he had to do was show up at the press conference, and already he was the greatest Bond ever. So Craig, following another such beloved Bond, might have had something to do with the animosity he got. Plus, it probably didn't help that Brosnan was still complaining about getting canned. It kind of looked like Craig stepped into the guy's shoes when Bros didn't even want to give them up. Finally, in November 2006, Casino Royale premiered. Hardcore Bond fans, critics, and the general public got to check out this new Craig, blonde Bond, and see if this long-awaited adaptation of Fleming's story was worth the wait, or if we would have just been better off with a Jinx film.
That's it? Anyone want to play poker now?